The world was holding its breath. The air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation, as if the very earth was aware that something monumental was about to occur. Across the scarred landscapes of Europe, a heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling the distant rumble of artillery and the faint metallic echo of war machines idling in the gloom. In a secluded railway siding deep within the forest of Compiègne, the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of wood and the soft, persistent drip of condensation from the carriage roof. The forest itself seemed to stand vigil, its trees shrouded in fog, their branches motionless in the still, damp air. The world outside was a tableau of devastation, ruined buildings, shattered emblems of empires, and maps redrawn by the violence of years past. Yet in this moment the environment was suspended between destruction and the faintest hope of renewal. The Western Front, a jagged scar stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, lay eerily quiet in some sectors, while in others the ground still trembled from the thunder of distant barrages. The trenches, carved deep into the earth, were cold and slick with mud, their walls echoing with the distant reverberations of artillery. Clocks ticked inexorably toward the appointed hour, their hands moving with agonizing slowness. The environment was charged with a paradoxical tension, white flags prepared but not yet raised, weapons still primed, the machinery of war poised on the edge of silence. In the fog-shrouded no-man's land the ground was pitted and cratered, the air thick with the acrid tang of cordite and the lingering haze of smoke. The sounds of war, sporadic gunfire, the distant thud of mortars, the shrill whistle of shells, rose and fell, sometimes fading into an uncanny quiet, sometimes erupting in sudden jarring violence. The landscape itself bore silent witness to the unfolding drama. Trenches snaked across the countryside, their parapets battered and broken, the ground between them churned into a lifeless morass. Telegraph wires hung slack, their messages of hope and despair carried on unseen currents, while the sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds, casting a pale, uncertain light over the devastation. In command posts and dugouts, the atmosphere was thick with calculation and anxiety. The logic of war dictated that every inch of ground, every fleeting moment, could tip the balance in the negotiations to come. Orders crackled over field telephones and telegraphs, their urgency heightened by the knowledge that the end was so near, yet not quite within reach. The final hours were marked by a strange, almost surreal duality, preparations for peace unfolding alongside the machinery of war grinding on. Runners dashed through the mud, relaying last-minute messages, while the distant rumble of artillery underscored the fragility of the impending silence. And then, as the clocks struck 11, a profound hush swept across the front. The guns, so long the voice of the war, fell silent one by one, their echoes fading into the mist. The environment, once defined by chaos and destruction, was suddenly transformed, still heavy, and filled with the weight of all that had come before. In that moment, the world exhaled. The 11th hour on the 11th day had arrived, and with it the hope that the scars of war might one day heal. The signatures on the Armistice document were still drying, the ink a dark stain on the crisp paper, but on the Western Front the ink of choice was still blood. The battlefield was a grim tableau of weaponry, a silent testament to the relentless violence that had unfolded. Barbed wire entanglements stretched across the landscape, while shattered trees stood as skeletal reminders of the relentless shelling. Abandoned tanks lay in no man's land, their hulking forms rusting amidst the debris of countless artillery shells. Gas masks hung on trench walls, a stark reminder of the chemical horrors that had plagued the soldiers. Bullet-riddled helmets and torn uniforms lay scattered, mingling with the personal belongings of those who had fought and fallen. Trench periscopes and communication wires crisscrossed the trenches, while signal flares lay unused, their purpose now obsolete. Artillery positions were littered with empty shell casings, sandbags piled high to offer protection that was no longer needed. Maps with marked positions and field telephones lay abandoned in command posts, their strategic importance now a relic of the past. Shattered buildings and crumbling walls stood as silent witnesses to the destruction, remnants of once thriving villages now reduced to rubble. Trenches filled with stagnant water and mud-caked duckboards stretched out, makeshift bridges spanning the craters left by relentless bombardments. Unexploded ordnance lay hidden beneath the surface, a lingering threat in the desolate expanse of no man's land. As fog rolled over the battlefield, an eerie silence settled, broken only by the distant sounds of sporadic gunfire. Smoke rose from smouldering ruins, the charred remains of equipment and scorched earth a testament to the ferocity of the conflict. Trenches stretched into the horizon, barbed wire glistening with dew as the morning light began to break through the clouds. Empty shell casings and discarded gas masks lay amidst the remnants of battlefield rations, a stark reminder of the human cost. Artillery pieces pointed skyward, their barrels silent, while machine gun nests and sandbag fortifications stood empty. Trenches wound through the landscape, barbed wire entanglements and craters filled with rainwater marking the path of destruction. Maps with strategic positions lay abandoned in field hospitals, medical supplies scattered in the wake of the Armistice. In the foggy dawn, the battlefield lay quiet, the silhouettes of artillery casting long shadows over the quiet aftermath of battle. Trenches filled with debris and barbed wire fences stood as a testament to the chaos, empty ammunition crates scattered about. As the fog lifted, sunlight broke through the clouds, revealing a serene landscape that belied the horrors that had unfolded. The empty trenches and abandoned weapons were a stark contrast to the quiet battlefield, a poignant reminder of the war's end. Artillery pieces covered in morning dew and barbed wire, glistening in the peaceful dawn, marked the end of an era of unprecedented violence. And so, in the fog-shrouded fields and shattered villages of the front, the killing continued. It was a microcosm of the entire war's futility, compressed into a few frantic, bloody hours, a final, desperate act in a play that had already run its course. History has a strange sense of symmetry, a sense of poetry that can be both beautiful and deeply cruel. Near the Belgian city of Mons, this symmetry is etched in stone. Here, in the immaculately kept rows of the St. Symphorien military cemetery, two graves face each other. They are separated by just a few paces, a small path of green grass. One grave marks the first British soldier killed in action on the Western Front in August 1914. The other belongs to Private George Edwin Ellison of the 5th Royal Irish Lancers. He was the last, the first and the last, bookending a conflict that consumed nearly 1 million British lives. George Ellison was not a young boy caught up in the patriotic fervour of 1914. He was a veteran, a man of 40. He had been a regular soldier before the war, a coal miner from Leeds who had seen it all. He had fought in the very first major battle of the war, the Battle of Mons in 1914. He had survived the gas attacks at Ypres, the slaughter of the Somme, the mud of Passchendaele, the tank battles at Cambrai. He had endured 4 years of unimaginable horror and had, by some miracle, come through it all. He was a survivor, a man who had seen friends and comrades fall all around him, yet had managed to stay alive. On the morning of November 11th, Ellison was back where it all began, on the outskirts of Mons. The circle was closing. His unit was on a routine patrol, scouting the edge of a wood. The news of the armistice was known. In just a couple of hours he would be able to lay down his rifle for good. He could begin to think of home, of his wife Hannah and his son James. The patrol encountered a pocket of German resistance, a machine-gun nest hidden among the trees. Shots were exchanged. As his unit began to pull back, a single rifle crack echoed through the woods. The bullet found George Ellison. He was killed instantly. The time was 9:30 in the morning. He had survived 4 years of hell, only to fall 90 minutes before the final whistle blew. His death was not part of a grand charge or a heroic last stand. It was a random, almost casual act of violence, the kind that had claimed millions of others. But its timing makes it stand out. It is a story of profound irony. The man who had been there at the beginning was killed at the very end. His final resting place, opposite the grave of the first British casualty, serves as a powerful, silent memorial to the entire span of the British sacrifice. The war for the Commonwealth forces also ended where it began, at Mons. The city had become a symbol, its streets and buildings bearing silent witness to the opening and closing acts of the conflict. In August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force had first encountered the German army here, marking the beginning of a long and brutal struggle. Now, in the war's final days, Mons was once again at the heart of history, its liberation a matter of immense pride for the Allied forces. The Canadian Corps leading the final assault saw the capture of Mons as the crowning achievement of their campaign, a symbol of victory and closure. Yet this triumph was shadowed by the cost paid up to the very last moments of the war. Among those who paid the ultimate price was George Lawrence Price, a farm labourer from Nova Scotia. Drafted into the army in late 1917, Price was a conscript, not a professional soldier. Like so many others, he was pulled from civilian life and thrust into the extraordinary circumstances of global conflict. He represented the millions of ordinary individuals who became part of the war's vast machinery. Serving with the 28th Northwest Battalion, Price endured the horrors of the front, including a gas attack in September. On November 11th, his unit advanced through the southern outskirts of Mons, tasked with clearing the last remnants of German resistance from the town. The setting was a labyrinth of narrow streets and winding canals, a treacherous environment for advancing troops. The urban landscape, scarred by war, concealed hidden dangers at every turn. Even as news of the impending ceasefire at 11 o'clock spread, the tension in the air was palpable. Patrols moved cautiously, aware that the threat of violence lingered. A German machine gun had been reported in a row of houses along the Canal du Centre. Determined to secure the area, Price and a small patrol pressed forward. They crossed a small bridge, entering the maze of buildings, and began a methodical search, house by house, room by room, alert for any sign of the enemy. In one house, a sudden confrontation erupted. After a brief exchange, the German defenders retreated and the Canadians gave chase, determined to secure the area before the ceasefire. The local Belgian population, newly liberated yet acutely aware of the dangers that remained, signalled warnings to the advancing soldiers, urging caution. They pleaded for restraint, reminding the soldiers that the war was nearly over and that every moment of risk was now doubly tragic. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and anxiety. The soldiers hesitated, torn between duty and the hope for imminent peace. Yet the momentum of battle and the adrenaline of pursuit proved irresistible, propelling the patrol forward despite the warnings. Price, focused on the mission, stepped out from the shelter of a house into the open street, a space transformed by war, silent and exposed. The time was 10:57 in the morning. Only 3 minutes remained before the armistice would take effect. From a building across the canal, a German sniper, perhaps covering a retreat, perhaps unaware of the ceasefire, took aim through the shattered window frames. A single sharp report echoed through the deserted street. The bullet found its mark, striking Price in the chest. He fell, the moment heavy with the weight of all that had come before and all that was about to end. Within a minute, at 10:58, the war claimed its final Commonwealth casualty in this setting of ruined streets and silent anticipation. 2 minutes later, the guns would fall silent and the world would pause in the hush of armistice. Today, a simple grave and memorial mark the place where George Price fell, a lasting reminder of the final moments of the Great War and the profound cost of peace. The final moments of the First World War on the Western Front are marked by a haunting silence and a landscape scarred by years of relentless conflict. The story of Private Henry Gunther, the last Allied casualty, is woven into the very earth of these battlefields, fields that bore witness to the war's final, senseless violence. The Western Front, on the morning of November 11th, 1918, was a place of cold, heavy mist and chilling quiet. The ground was churned and cratered, the trenches lined with sandbags and the remnants of hastily constructed defences. The air was thick with anticipation as the world waited for the guns to fall silent. The weaponry of the era, bolt-action rifles, bayonets, and the ever-present machine guns, stood ready even as the promise of peace drew near. The tools of war, silent for a moment, seemed to hold their breath. Orders and messages travelled along the front, carried by runners and field telephones. At 10:44 the armistice announcement arrived, a message that would echo through the trenches and across the battered fields. The German positions, fortified with machine guns and reinforced with layers of barbed wire, faced the American lines across a desolate expanse. Both sides, aware of the impending ceasefire, hesitated, an unofficial truce settling over the landscape. 16 minutes remained. The battlefield, so often alive with chaos, now seemed suspended in time. The ticking of a pocket watch, the distant echo of a shell, the rustle of wind through barbed wire, these were the only sounds. The tools of war, from the Springfield rifles to the German MG-08S, were poised for one final act. The bayonet, a symbol of close combat, gleamed in the dim light, a silent witness to the desperation that still lingered. The battlefield itself seemed to mourn, its scars deep and unhealed. The fog concealed the devastation, but the evidence of struggle was everywhere. Abandoned equipment, shattered defences, and the ever-present mud. As the final minute approached, the German machine gun crews, their weapons ready but their hearts unwilling, waited behind their barricades. The machinery of war, built for destruction, stood at the edge of obsolescence. In that last tragic moment, the silence was shattered by a brief, reluctant burst from a machine gun. The weapon, designed for relentless fire, spoke one final time before the world changed. The time was 10:59. 60 seconds later, the armistice took effect. The battlefield, once a place of unimaginable violence, fell utterly silent. The records of that day, preserved in official documents and memorials, mark the end of the war and the final sacrifice made upon these fields. The landscape, forever changed, stands as a testament to the cost of conflict and the hope for peace. The landscape of the Western Front in France by November 1918 was a vision of utter devastation. The ground was churned and cratered, a patchwork of mud and shattered earth, where once fields and forests had thrived. Tangled barbed wire snaked across the ruined terrain, and the remnants of wooden duckboards, half sunken in muck, marked the paths soldiers had trodden for years. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of cordite and damp earth, a silence broken only by the distant echo of artillery and the wind sighing through the empty shell holes. In the midst of this desolation, the memory of rural France lingered. Rolling hills and quiet pastures, now far removed from the front. The equipment scattered across the trenches told the story of endurance. Battered helmets, dented canteens, and mud-caked rifles resting against sandbags. The trenches themselves, carved deep into the earth, were lined with corrugated iron and reinforced with wooden planks, their walls slick with moisture and the ever-present mud. The broader military situation was tense, even as the end approached. Command posts, camouflaged beneath netting and sandbags, were cluttered with field telephones, stacks of paperwork, and the ever-present maps marked with coloured pins. The front lines snaked along the Meuse River, its banks shrouded in morning mist, the water reflecting the grey sky above. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, a strange quiet settling over the battered landscape as the news of the armistice filtered through the lines. In the trenches, the soldiers' equipment was neatly stacked in anticipation of the ceasefire. Mess tins ready for the first peaceful meal, bayonets sheathed and greatcoats buttoned against the November chill. The field kitchens, little more than battered cauldrons over smoky fires, were being prepared for the distribution of hot soup, a simple comfort after years of hardship. Orders were still being written and dispatched, the machinery of war grinding on even as the clock ticked toward peace. Messages, scribbled hastily on scraps of paper, were passed from hand to hand, destined for the front lines. The message that would be carried across the battlefield was mundane, an instruction for the men to gather for food at 11:30 after the guns fell silent. The note itself was unremarkable, written in a steady hand. Rassemblement à 11h30 pour le ravitaillement. The paper, creased and smudged, was tucked into a leather satchel alongside other orders and maps. The runner's path led across open ground, the mud sucking at boots, the shattered stumps of trees looming like ghosts in the morning haze. The only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery and the soft slap of water in shell holes. The message he carried was not one of attack, but of peace, a simple instruction about food, marking the transition from war to the hope of normalcy. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The first meal, in a time of non-war, was about to be served, the field kitchen fires promising warmth and sustenance. The horizon glowed with the pale light of dawn, illuminating the battered landscape and hinting at a future just minutes away. As the runner crossed a rickety footbridge spanning a shallow, debris-strewn stream, the world seemed to hold its breath. The bridge creaked underfoot, the water below reflecting the grey sky and the twisted remains of war. Then, in the stillness, a single shot rang out, echoing across the empty fields. The time was approximately 10:45 in the morning. The message and the hope it carried fell silent in the mud. In the aftermath, the landscape remained unchanged, scarred, silent, and bearing witness to the final moments of a war that had consumed a generation. The official records, shaped by political necessity, would obscure the truth of that last morning, but the land itself would remember, marked forever by the cost of peace. The final hours of the war were filled with these cruel twists of fate, stories of men whose luck simply ran out at the finish line. The very nature of the armistice created these pockets of lethal misunderstanding. The message of peace had to travel through a landscape designed for war. Telegraph wires were cut by artillery, runners were shot, and entire units could be isolated, unaware that the world had changed. An order given by Marshal Foch at 10:50 in the morning stated, "Hostilities will cease on the whole front as from November 11th at 11 o'clock. The Allied troops will not, until further orders, go beyond the line reached on that date and at that hour." This message itself became a life-or-death gamble for the men tasked with its delivery. Consider the psychological state of the soldiers. They had been programmed for years to kill or be killed. The instinct for survival was intertwined with the instinct to fight. To suddenly switch that off at a precise, pre-arranged time was a monumental mental challenge. In some sectors, the fighting did not stop cleanly at 11 o'clock. A British diary entry notes that a German machine gunner who kept firing after the deadline had to be killed at 11:15 in the morning. The muscle memory of war was hard to overcome. The silence had to be imposed, sometimes by one last act of violence. These individual stories of Gunther, Price, Ellison, Trébuchon are not just historical footnotes. They are the human face of a statistical tragedy. They represent the final, pointless expenditure of life in a war defined by its pointlessness. Their deaths are so poignant because they happened on the very threshold of peace. They had crossed the vast bloody ocean of the war only to drown in sight of the shore. Their stories force us to confront the cold, bureaucratic logic of war, where men's lives can be weighed against a few yards of captured ground or a point of political pride. And then it came. At precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, Paris time, the world seemed to hold its breath. The great roaring engine of the Western Front began to shudder to a halt, not with a sudden stop, but with a slow, unravelling exhale. For 4.5 years the air had been thick with the relentless percussion of war. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with the endless barrage, the sky forever torn by the shriek of shells and the staccato rattle of gunfire. The sound was a living thing, pressing in on every surface, seeping into the very soil. It was a physical weight, a constant suffocating presence that filled every hollow and every shattered tree. The landscape was shaped by noise, craters echoing with distant thunder, trenches trembling with each new detonation, the wind carrying the metallic tang of cordite and the acrid scent of smoke. But now, along a 400-mile front, the transformation began. The thunder of the heavy guns faltered, their rhythm breaking, then falling silent one by one. The machine guns sputtered, their chatter fading into memory. The sharp cracks of rifles grew sporadic, then ceased altogether. The last shell arced through the air, its whine slicing the morning, and then nothing. The echoes rolled away, swallowed by the vastness of the ruined land. The silence that followed was not gentle, it was sudden, jarring, and absolute. It pressed down on the battlefield with an almost unbearable intensity, amplifying every small sound, the drip of water from a broken sandbag, the soft sigh of wind through barbed wire, the distant caw of a lone crow. The environment itself seemed transformed. The smoke that had hung heavy began to drift and thin, revealing the stark outlines of shattered trees and cratered earth. The mist rolled in, curling around the debris, softening the brutal edges of destruction. The mud, churned and scarred by years of violence, glistened in the pale winter light. Pools of rainwater in shell holes reflected the sky, undisturbed for the first time in memory. The air, once thick with the taste of gunpowder, grew cold and clean. The only movement was the slow settling of dust, the gentle sway of tattered banners caught on wire, the trembling of leaves in a breeze that no longer carried the threat of death. The silence was not the peace of a world restored, but the absence of everything that had come before. It was a void, heavy with the memory of violence, echoing with the ghosts of sound. The emotional weight was immense. The land itself seemed to mourn, holding the scars of battle in mute testimony. The silence was a presence, filling every empty trench, every shattered dugout, every cratered field. In that moment the Western Front was transformed, not by victory, but by the sudden, overwhelming absence of war. The silence descended, and the world was changed forever. The aftermath of the First World War is written not only in history books, but in the very soil of Europe. The land itself became a silent witness, scarred and transformed by years of relentless conflict. Across the Western Front the earth was churned and cratered, trenches snaking through fields that once grew wheat and poppies. Even as the guns fell silent, the land bore the memory of violence. In the years that followed, the fields were ploughed once more, forests slowly regrew, and villages rose from the ruins. Yet beneath the surface the remnants of war remained. Every spring, as farmers tilled the soil, they unearthed the iron harvest, tons of unexploded shells, rusted shrapnel, and relics of battle. The war, though ended, lingered just below the ground, a hidden legacy. Mist drifts over empty trenches at dawn, and the poppies bloom where soldiers once fought. The landscape, peaceful now, is layered with memory. The cemeteries, with their endless rows of white headstones, rise from the earth as silent markers of what was lost. The land holds these stories in quiet dignity. In places where the first and last shots were fired, the soil is a library of echoes, each relic, each scar, a page in the story of the war's aftermath. Today the fields of Flanders and France are quiet, the forests thick and green, the villages alive with new generations. But the war is still there, just beneath the surface, in the rusted metal and the silent trenches. The passage of time has softened the scars, but not erased them. The land remembers, holding the echoes of conflict and the hope of renewal. As we look upon these fields, let us remember the silent testimony of the soil, the enduring presence of the past and the resilience of the earth to heal and carry on. As the armistice silenced the thunder of artillery, the land itself bore the true weight of war's legacy. Across the battlefields, great craters pocked the countryside, water-filled basins where shells had gouged deep wounds into the earth. In every direction the ground was churned and uneven, its natural contours obliterated by relentless barrages. Twisted remnants of barbed wire snaked through the mud, half buried beneath layers of silt and grass. Rusted artillery pieces, too damaged to salvage, lay abandoned in shattered positions, their barrels pointing skyward like grave markers. Wheels, axles, and broken gun carriages littered the fields, slowly sinking into the soil with each passing season. No trees stood untouched. Forests were stripped of splintered trunks, their limbs torn away by shrapnel. Entire groves had vanished, replaced by tangled undergrowth and scattered debris. In places where villages once stood, only foundations and fragments of brick remained, scattered among the shell holes. Rainwater collected in the craters, forming stagnant pools where nothing grew. The soil itself, poisoned by explosives and chemicals, resisted new life. In some areas a strange silence lingered. Birds and animals slow to return, the delicate balance of nature interrupted by the violence of war. As years passed, grass crept back and wildflowers bloomed among the ruins. But beneath the surface the scars endured. The iron harvest continued. Farmers turning up shell fragments and spent bullets, the detritus of battle refusing to be forgotten. The landscape remained a testament to the power and devastation of artillery. Even without a single human figure in sight, the aftermath was unmistakable. A world reshaped by steel and fire, where the echoes of war would linger for generations. Winding across the landscape like scars, the abandoned trenches stretched for miles, silent witnesses to the conflict that raged above and below their earthen walls. Dug deep into the soil, these zigzagging corridors once teemed with desperate activity. Now they lie still, their timber supports rotting, sandbags slumped and sodden from years of rain. Each trench was a feat of makeshift engineering. Narrow duckboards run along the bottom, many now broken or submerged in muddy water, their planks warped and splintered. Here and there rusted tin cans and battered helmets nestle in the silt, half buried beneath layers of fallen leaves and debris. Ammunition boxes, empty and warped, lean against the walls, their stenciled markings faded by time. Coils of barbed wire once strung along the parapets have collapsed into tangled heaps, their sharp edges dulled by rust but still menacing. In the deeper dugouts, wooden beams sag over entrances choked by dirt and undergrowth. Collapsed ladders lead nowhere, while shattered periscopes and broken lanterns lie forgotten in the gloom. The faint outline of fire steps can still be traced, worn smooth by the passage of countless boots. Rats' nests and burrowed animal tracks now occupy the niches where soldiers once huddled for shelter. Above, the open sky is framed by shattered revetments and the broken line of the parapet. Wind whistles through the empty corridors, carrying only the soft patter of rain or the distant call of a bird. No voices echo here now, only the gentle drip of water and the quiet settling of earth. These trenches, once the front lines between life and death, have become part of the silent landscape. Their walls crumble, but their shape endures, a sombre reminder of the lives lived and lost within their narrow embrace. In the hush that follows conflict, the trenches remain, hollowed monuments to endurance, fear, and the hope for peace. As the world edged toward peace, the landscape of war remained dominated by the relentless presence of machines. In those final minutes before the ceasefire, tanks rumbled forward, hulking steel beasts crawling over shattered earth. Their caterpillar tracks churned through mud and crater, engines growling, armor pitted and scarred from months of battle. These armored vehicles, once a new terror on the battlefield, now moved with a sense of urgency and exhaustion, their guns trained on distant horizons even as the war's end approached. Nearby, the thunder of artillery persisted. Cannons, some as large as railway cars, recoiled one last time, sending shells spiralling through the grey dawn. The air shuddered with the echo of explosions, each shell a final punctuation mark in a long and brutal sentence. Spent casings littered the ground, their metallic sheen dulled by mud and blood. Field guns and howitzers, their crews poised for one more barrage, stood as silent titans when the clock struck 11, barrels smoking, gears grinding to a halt. Communication devices, the unseen arteries of the front, crackled with static in the trenches and dugouts. Field telephones, their wires snaking through the mud, relayed urgent orders and final ceasefire confirmations. Operators hunched over Morse keys, tapping out the last frantic messages, dots and dashes racing to cross the no-man's land faster than the bullets. Signal lamps blinked from command posts, their beams cutting through mist and smoke, while carrier pigeons, tiny messengers in a world of giants, took flight from battered cages, wings beating against the wind. In these closing moments, technology and machinery, a symphony of gears, cables, barrels, and signals, wove together the final chapter of the conflict. No faces are seen, only the tools of war, battered, blackened, and still. As silence fell, the machines grew quiet, their purpose spent. They remain scattered across the fields, relics of humanity's ingenuity and its capacity for destruction. The 11th hour brought not only silence, but a transformation of the land itself. Under a sky heavy with low, bruised clouds, the morning light struggled to pierce the lingering haze of gunpowder and smoke. The air, thick and damp, carried the scent of churned soil and scorched grass, a bitter perfume left in the wake of battle. Where once meadows and forests stretched, there now lay a patchwork of raw, wounded earth. Shell craters yawned wide, brimming with rainwater that reflected the grey sky above. Pools of mud stretched between shattered tree stumps, their bark stripped and branches splintered, standing as mute sentinels to the devastation. Grass and wildflowers, once vibrant, now lay flattened or gone entirely, replaced by a tangled mat of roots exposed and lifeless. Barbed wire, twisted and rusted, snaked through the fields, half buried in the mire. Stones and debris, upturned by explosions, dotted the landscape like scars. Streams, once clear, ran cloudy with silt. Their banks collapsed and watercourses redirected by the relentless pounding of artillery. In the distance, a broken windmill turned listlessly in the breeze, its vanes missing and its frame leaning precariously. Birds circled warily overhead, their calls subdued in the unnatural quiet. The wind, once filled with the sounds of battle, now whispered over the ruins, stirring dust and ash into gentle eddies. No footprints marked the ground, only the deep impressions of tank treads and the gouges left by heavy guns. The land itself bore witness, transformed into a silent testament of conflict. Nature, battered but persistent, waited for its slow reclamation, the first green shoots already beginning to push up through the scarred soil. In this moment, the weather and the wounded earth stood as the only witnesses to the end of war, holding the memory of thunder and fire in every cloud, every crater, every broken blade of grass. In the weeks and months that followed the armistice, the silence of the battlefields was slowly filled with signs of life. At first it was almost imperceptible, a faint shimmer of green along the lip of a crater, the tentative unfurling of a fern between shards of splintered wood. Moss crept across the raw faces of stones, softening their edges and stitching the wounds of the earth with a living thread. From the edges of shattered forests, saplings began to push skyward, their leaves trembling in the breeze. Wildflowers, their seeds long buried beneath the churned soil, found the courage to bloom. Poppies, crimson and defiant, dotted the fields where soldiers once fell, their petals vivid against the grey mud. With the return of plants came the quiet footsteps of animals. Hares ventured from thickets to nibble at the new shoots. Small birds flitted among the barbed wire, weaving nests in the twisted metal and singing tentative songs into the clear post-war air. Frogs returned to the water-filled craters, their calls echoing at dusk. Insects, the first pioneers, swarmed over the ground, beetles, ants and butterflies reclaiming their old domains. Over time, foxes and deer appeared at the forest's edge, cautious but emboldened by the absence of gunfire. At dawn, the distant call of an owl echoed from a hollow tree, a reminder that life, though battered, was never fully lost. Season by season, nature pressed forward. Grass mended the scars left by tank treads, and wild vines climbed over rusted helmets and relics abandoned in haste. The land, once marked by violence, began to heal, its wounds closing beneath a tapestry of green and gold, and so, without witness or ceremony, the battlefield was transformed. The earth's quiet resilience turned devastation into renewal, the memory of conflict slowly fading beneath the gentle, persistent touch of sun, rain, and root. In this rebirth the world whispered a hope for peace, carried on the wings of every returning bird and in every new blade of grass.